Cole Mercer had never once in his life asked anyone for help. Not when he was 19 and sleeping on the floor of a studio apartment in Pittsburgh, eating canned soup for dinner and studying financial models by lamplight at 2 in the morning. Not when his first startup nearly collapsed and 3 of his early investors pulled out in the same week. Not when a rival tried to bury him with a lawsuit that should have ended everything before it began. He had built Mercer Industries out of refusal. The refusal to fail. The refusal to accept that the world was arranged in a way he couldn't rearrange. By 36, the company he had built from nothing spanned technology infrastructure, commercial real estate, and defense contracting across 14 states. His name appeared on buildings. His phone calls were returned within the hour by senators and foreign ministers. Markets shifted when he moved. He was the man who never lost. Until his own body decided to disagree. It started small. A moment of dizziness in the middle of a board presentation that he dismissed as dehydration. A hand tremor during a dinner in Washington that he hid beneath the table, chalked up to exhaustion, and forgot about by morning. A word that vanished from his mind mid-sentence, just once, in a private call with his chief legal officer. He filled the silence so smoothly that no one noticed. Cole Mercer noticed. He flew to Boston the following week and paid a private neurology practice enough money that the appointment never appeared in any system tied to his name. The first round of tests came back inconclusive. He went back. Then again. Then to a specialist in London. Then a research team in Zurich. By the time the diagnosis arrived, it had a long name that Cole read 3 times before it settled in. A rare progressive neurological disorder. Degenerative. No approved treatment. No confirmed case of reversal. The expected trajectory, presented in careful clinical language across a 12-page report, was steady cognitive decline over months to years, followed by complete incapacitation. The most expensive doctors in the world had told him there was nothing they could do. Cole thanked them, folded the report into his briefcase, walked to the elevator, pressed the button for the ground floor, and stood in silence for 17 floors. He didn't cry. He didn't rage. He looked at the metal doors as they opened onto the lobby and thought the same thought he had thought at 19, at 23, at every moment in his life when something had tried to stop him. There has to be another way. He just didn't know yet that the other way would be found by a 24-year-old woman who ran a community center and paid her bills late and carried her grandfather's knowledge in a worn leather journal on a closet shelf in Cincinnati. He didn't know that the only person about to save his life was someone his own world would try, with everything it had, to destroy before she could. If that already has your attention, stay right here. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because what happens next will stay with you for a long time. Cincinnati has a sound that people from the river neighborhoods carry with them for the rest of their lives. It's the sound of screen doors and distant freight trains and the particular quiet that settles over a block after midnight when even the convenience stores have closed and the only light comes from windows of people who cannot sleep. That was the sound of Petra Hadley's entire life. She was 24, working double shifts at a diner called Rennick's 3 mornings a week and the rest of her hours at the Northside Community Center, where she ran programs for elderly residents and at-risk youth and occasionally fixed the water heater herself because the maintenance budget had been cut, again, and there was no one else who would. She drove a 2009 Civic with a cracked taillight. She bought her mother's prescriptions before she bought groceries. She knew every late payment policy for every utility company in Hamilton County by memory, because she had called all of them at least twice. She had not finished her degree. She had been 2 semesters from it when her mother's diagnosis forced her to stop and recalculate. She had called it temporary for a year. Then she had stopped calling it anything. Her mother, Patricia, was 61 years old and had been managing a chronic autoimmune condition for 8 years on a fixed income with a prescription list that shifted every few months depending on what the insurance would cover. Most mornings, Petra checked the medication count before she checked anything else. Her brother Marcus was 21. He had spent 2 years making his way back from something Petra did not describe in detail to people she didn't know well. He was doing better. Better was not the same as stable, and Petra knew the difference. She was holding three things together with the particular quiet strength of someone who had never once been asked whether the weight was too much. What Petra had, sitting in a wooden box on the top shelf of her closet, was her grandfather's journal. Silas Hadley had spent his entire life in the hill country of eastern Kentucky, the kind of man who knew the names of plants that had no names in any pharmacy catalog. He hadn't distrusted hospitals out of ignorance. He had seen enough of them to understand what they couldn't reach. His grandmother had been a healer before hospitals found those mountains. She had taught him what she knew, and he had written it down in careful, cramped handwriting across 212 pages of a journal he kept for 40 years. When Silas died, he left the journal to Petra. Not to her mother. Not to her cousins. To Petra. Because you're the one who will use it, he had said, 6 months before the end, sitting with her on the porch in late summer light. The others will put it in a box. You'll read it. She had read it twice, front to back. She had started flagging pages, cross-referencing plants in botanical databases, comparing his observations to academic studies she pulled through the county library's research portal. She wasn't a scientist. But she was precise and curious, and she had learned that those two things together, with enough patience, could carry a person further than the world expected. Most people, when she mentioned the journal, smiled gently. Superstition, they called it. Folk remedies. Petra did not argue. She knew what she had seen it do. She had seen it quiet a neighbor's tremors after a bad fall when his family couldn't afford the follow-up neurology appointment. She had seen it work on her mother's inflammation when 3 rounds of prescribed anti-inflammatories hadn't moved the needle. She had kept both things quiet, because she understood how the world received that kind of information, and she was not in a position to make herself a target. She had no reason to expect that any of it would ever intersect with a man like Cole Mercer. Then, on a Wednesday night in October, at 11:47 in the evening, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up to the Northside Community Center at a speed that said something was very wrong. Cole had been in the air when the episode hit. His private jet was 40 minutes out of Pittsburgh, somewhere over southern Ohio, when his vision fractured at the edges and collapsed inward. His hands stopped responding the way hands were supposed to respond. He was aware he was speaking but could not track what he was saying. His head of security, Briggs, a former Army Ranger who had worked for Cole for 6 years across 4 continents, later said it was the most frightened he had ever been on a job. They declared an emergency landing at Cincinnati Lunken Airport. The hospital was 22 minutes in Wednesday traffic. The community center was 4 minutes away. Briggs made the calculation. Petra was finishing the week's supply inventory when the doors blew open. She came out to find 3 large men carrying a 4th through the entrance, one barking into a phone, the other 2 fighting to hold the man upright. The man being carried was tall. Well dressed in the way of someone who spent money without thinking about it. And he was shaking with a tremor pattern that sent a cold line of clarity straight down Petra's spine. She had seen that pattern before. Not in a hospital. Not in a textbook. Page 107. Set him down here. She moved 2 chairs and pointed to the long padded bench along the wall. Lay him flat. Don't elevate his head yet. Briggs turned toward her with the look of someone who did not take instructions from women in community centers at midnight. We need to reach his medical team. His medical team is not in this room, Petra said. Lay him flat. Now. Something in her voice settled it. They laid him down. Cole was conscious but distorted. His eyes tracked toward the ceiling light. His right hand tremored more severely than his left. Petra knelt beside him, assessed the rhythm of it, looked at his eyes, and said his name once, clearly. He turned toward her voice. That was something. She went to the supply room. She came back with 3 things and worked without explaining herself because the time for explaining was not now. 22 minutes later, when the ambulance arrived, the tremors had reduced significantly. Cole's speech was coherent. His hands were no longer shaking at the same frequency. The paramedics exchanged a look that Briggs noted and filed away. Cole, being lifted onto the stretcher, turned his head toward the woman kneeling on the linoleum floor at midnight. "Who are you?" The words came out slower than he intended. "Petra Hadley," she said. "I run this center." He held her gaze for a moment that lasted longer than the situation required. Then they took him out into the October night. Petra sat back on her heels and looked at the space where he had been. She thought about page 107. She thought about what Silas had written about what came after the initial intervention, if it held. She was probably never going to see any of them again. She was wrong. The call came 4 days later. "Briggs, not an assistant." "Ms. Hadley. My employer is at the Cleveland Clinic. His condition has deteriorated since the night at your facility. Before he agrees to an experimental protocol his team is recommending, he wants to speak with you." Petra was in her car outside Rennick's. 12 minutes before her shift. "Why?" she said. "Because what you did that night changed something his team cannot explain. He'd like to understand what it was." A pause. "He said to tell you he'll cover any expenses." "He can cover his own expenses," Petra said. "I'll think about it." She thought about it through for hours of table service. She called her mother at her break. She came home and took the journal down and opened it to page 107 and read it the way she always read something she was considering seriously. Not looking for confirmation. Looking for the places she might be wrong. She didn't find them. She called Briggs at 9 that evening. "I'll come. But if his doctors won't talk to me like a peer, I walk." "Understood," Briggs said. Cole Mercer was lying in a hospital bed in Cleveland when Petra walked in carrying a worn leather journal and a canvas tote bag with Cincinnati Parks and Recreation on the side. She sat across from him without being invited to. She looked at him the way she had looked at him on the floor of the community center. Not with awe. Not with the deference his world delivered automatically. She looked at him like a problem she was working out. "You're worse," she said. "Yes," he said. She asked him questions his doctors hadn't asked. Diet in detail going back 6 months. Timing of the worst episodes. Whether the symptoms followed a morning versus evening pattern. Travel. Sleep. And then one question that made him go still, whether in the past year he had spent extended time in any environment with unusual industrial exposure. He told her about the Pennsylvania site. A decommissioned facility his company had been developing. Standard environmental clearances. Legal had reviewed everything. But he remembered the air in certain buildings having a quality he had written off as old infrastructure. A taste. A specific heaviness he hadn't named at the time. Petra wrote it down and cross-referenced the journal. She was quiet for 90 seconds. Then she turned it toward him and read her grandfather's documentation of 2 men from a Kentucky mining community. The same pattern. The same right-side dominance. The environmental exposure that had preceded both cases. The intervention that had reversed the deterioration in both of them over months. Cole read the page himself. "My grandfather wasn't a doctor," Petra said. "I'm not a doctor. What I know is that what he documented matches what I observed in you more precisely than anything I've read about your diagnosis." Cole looked at the journal. Then at her. "My team is recommending a clinical trial protocol," he said. 32% success rate. I know what the protocol is. I looked it up. You looked up a neurological clinical trial protocol. I have a library card and I read fast. He watched her face. There was no calculation in it. No performance. The complete absence of that particular quality that everyone in his world performed so naturally was, he realized, what had made him ask Briggs to call her. He hadn't been able to name it before. Now he could. She told him what her approach would involve. The dietary protocol. The plant-based compounds from the journal. The environmental triggers to eliminate. And one thing she said carefully, watching his face, a minimum of 60 days away from the schedules and pressure systems that ran his current life. You're telling me to stop working. I'm telling you the system running your body right now cannot sustain the system running your company. One of them is going to give. And one of them is replaceable. He looked out the window. Cleveland in November, grey and cold. My board will read it as collapse. There are 3 acquisition deals in negotiation. I know what your company is and what stepping back would mean, she said. I also know you've been sitting in boardrooms with your hand pressed against your thigh under the table so no one could see the shaking. She let that land. I know because that's exactly what the men in my grandfather's notes did. Right up until they couldn't anymore. The room was very quiet. What I'm asking, Petra said quietly, is whether any of it matters if you're not there to see what it becomes. He didn't answer. But he didn't look away. She stood to leave. At the door he spoke. I want to offer compensation for your time. Whatever figure. No, she said, turning back. Why not? Because if I take your money, I become one more thing you've purchased. And what you need right now is something you cannot buy. She left. Cole sat alone in the hospital room and looked at the journal she had left open on the table beside him. He read page 107 3 times. Then he called Dr. Oya Abrams at Ohio State at 6 the following morning. She called back 2 hours later after reviewing photographs of the journal pages, her voice carrying something it hadn't held in the first call. Where did this come from? She asked. A woman named Petra Hadley, Cole said. She runs a community center in Cincinnati. A long pause. Mr. Mercer, Dr. Abrams said, do not lose track of her. What happened next in that hospital corridor, no one told Petra about until much later. Dr. Alden Price, Cole's personal physician for 4 years, pulled Briggs aside before Cole's discharge and spoke quietly and precisely. He said Cole was critically ill. He said he was placing his trust in a young woman with no medical degree and nothing to offer but a handwritten notebook. He said when it failed, and it would fail, the liability exposure would be significant. Briggs listened without expression. I'll note you raised the concern, Briggs said. Then he went back inside. Price stood in the corridor. He thought for a moment. Then he took out his phone. He did not call a colleague. He called Weston, Cole's longest-standing board member. The man who had been in that boardroom for 9 years, who had a personal financial interest in 3 of the 4 acquisition deals currently in play, and who had already, quietly, begun making contingency calls about what would happen to those deals if Cole Mercer was no longer able to close them. Weston listened. He thanked Price. He said he would handle it. Neither of them considered, in that conversation, that what they were setting in motion was not protection of Cole Mercer. It was the removal of the only person who could save him. Cole checked out of the Cleveland clinic against Price's explicit advice. He rented a quiet property outside Cincinnati and told the board he was pursuing a specialized treatment protocol for 60 days. He said his COO would handle operations in the interim. He said it clearly, firmly, and with the specific tone of someone who was not asking for approval. Weston called him that evening. His voice carried the tone of a man who had pre-decided the outcome. Cole. I'll be direct. 2 board members have spoken with Dr. Price. He has serious reservations. The market is watching the volume of your public absence. If this becomes a story about a billionaire abandoning proven treatment for folk medicine, the institutional damage. I'll manage it, Cole said. There are members of this board who are asking whether you are in a position to manage anything, Weston said. I'm telling you this as someone who has been in your corner for 9 years. Demonstrate fitness for leadership clearly and soon, or there will be a conversation without you in the room. Cole was quiet for a moment. I appreciate the warning, he said. Good night, Weston. He ended the call and sat in the quiet kitchen of the rented house and thought about the word fitness, and what it had meant to him for 36 years, and whether the version of it he had lived by was actually what it sounded like. Petra came every other evening after her shifts. She arrived in the Civic with the cracked taillight and brought what she needed in the canvas bag and worked at the kitchen table or on the back porch when the nights allowed. She was precise and unsentimental. She explained what she was doing and why. She answered every question he asked, and he asked many, and he never once performed understanding he didn't have. That was something she noticed and kept noticing. Powerful men, in her experience, almost never admitted to not understanding something. The admission felt too much like losing. Cole wrote questions down in a small notebook he kept beside his coffee and asked them straight and waited for the full answer. She found, without meaning to, that she looked forward to the evenings. 3 weeks in, Cole set his pen down and looked at her across the table. "The Pennsylvania site," he said. "If the exposure is what you think." "I've been thinking about the workers there since the night you left my center," she said. "I didn't raise it because I didn't know how to raise it with a man who could shut everything down with a phone call. I wouldn't have." "You might have," she said. Not unkindly. "You were a different person 4 weeks ago." He accepted that without argument. "What would you do?" he asked. "Independent testing for every worker at that site. Not company affiliated. And I'd make the data from your case available to Dr. Abrams anonymously so she can build a real study." She paused. "And the site should be remediated. Not because lawyers recommend it. Because it's right. That's an expensive position." "Most right things are," she said. He looked at his hands. His right one was almost completely still. "They're better," she said. "I know," he said quietly. He looked up at her. The expression on his face was one she didn't have an immediate word for, the look of a man who had been carrying something very heavy, alone, for a long time, and had been permitted, for the first time, to set it down. "Why did you come?" he asked. "Not the logistical version. The real one." Petra looked at the journal on the table between them. "My grandfather spent his life being told that what he knew didn't count," she said. "Because it wasn't credentialed. Because it didn't come from the right buildings. He helped people anyway. Because the knowledge was real, and they needed it, and those two things were enough." She met Cole's eyes. "I came because you needed it and it was real. That's the whole reason." He held her gaze. "I haven't thanked you properly," he said. "I'd rather you do something with it," she said. Then Price made his move. He had a contact at a national media desk. It was not a formal relationship. It was the kind of arrangement that existed in the spaces between professional ethics, where information moved without a paper trail and no one technically broke any rules and someone's life got dismantled anyway. He gave them her name. Not her role in Cole's treatment. Not the journal or the science. Just her name, her address, and the information that she had been meeting privately with Cole Mercer at a rented property outside Cincinnati for 3 weeks. The story ran on a Thursday morning. Petra was at Rennick's when it broke. She found out because a customer showed her the article on his phone while she was refilling his coffee. She read it in 12 seconds. She set the coffee pot down carefully on the counter and finished the table. Her manager called her to the back 10 minutes later. He couldn't look at her directly. He said some people had been calling the diner with questions. He said it might be better for everyone if she took personal time until things settled. She looked at him. 3 years. She had covered shifts nobody wanted. She had trained 2 new hires. She had stayed late dozens of times without being asked and never once called in sick when she wasn't. She took off her apron. She folded it onto the counter. She said she understood. She walked to the Civic and sat in it without starting it for a long time. The October Street moved around her. People going into the diner, coming out. None of them knew what had just happened inside. She started the engine. She drove home to check her mother's medication count before anything else. The prescriptions were low. She had been covering Rennick's for 2 weeks straight to build up a buffer for exactly this kind of month, and now that buffer was gone before she'd had a chance to use it. She did the numbers on her phone in the parking lot outside the pharmacy. She was $43 short of what the month required. She sat with that for a moment. Then she moved her grocery money to cover it, which meant the grocery money was gone, which meant this week's food would come from whatever was already in the kitchen, which she already knew was not much. She did not call Cole. She did not call Briggs. She drove to the community center because she had a 5 o'clock program to run and children who had nowhere else to be at 5 o'clock, and the world would have to arrange itself around that fact. She was halfway through the after-school session when Devon, 12 years old, mother on night shift, 2 years coming to the center, pulled out his phone and held it toward her quietly. He wasn't trying to be cruel. He just wanted her to know what people were saying. It was a comment section. Hundreds of entries. The language in it was the language comment sections always found when a woman without money was seen near a man with it. Petra looked at the screen for one moment. She handed the phone back. She finished the session. She locked up at 7:30 and sat alone in the empty center and called her mother. "You sound like someone about to stop," her mother said. "I'm not going to stop," Petra said. "I know you're not," her mother said. "I just needed to hear you say it." Petra looked at the journal in her bag. "He needs 2 more weeks," she said. "At minimum." "Then give him 2 more weeks," her mother said simply. Petra drove to the rented property the next evening. She was 20 minutes later than usual. Cole looked at her face when she came in and said her name the way he said it now, like a question that already knew its answer. "Price gave them your name," he said. "I know." She sat down. She did not put her bag on the table. "He also spoke with your board," she said. "He's been working against this since the Cleveland clinic." Cole was quiet for a moment. "I know that too. I found out 2 days ago." She looked at him. "What are you going to do?" He looked at his hands on the table. Both of them still. Completely, unmistakably still. "Tell the truth," he said. "All of it. In public. Before they get to tell their version." Petra held his gaze. "That exposes the company. The Pennsylvania site. Your own judgment. Everything." "Yes," he said. "Your board will fight it." "Yes," he said again. "And you're going to do it anyway." Cole looked at the journal between them on the table. Then at her. "You drove here tonight," he said, "after they printed your name and your address and implied everything that story implied, and you still came." He paused. "I think the least I can do is be as honest as that." The kitchen was quiet. The November dark pressed against the windows. Petra picked up her bag and set it on the table and unzipped it. 2 more weeks, she said. 2 more weeks, he said. 3 days before the press conference, a call came through Briggs. A worker at the Pennsylvania site had collapsed on the job floor. His name was Ray Okafor. 43 years old, 7 years with Mercer Industries, father of 2. The same right-side tremor pattern Cole had shown in the early months. The same morning versus evening rhythm. The company doctor on site had called it stress-related exhaustion and sent him home. Briggs told Cole. Cole told Petra. She was quiet for a long moment. "Is his family in Cincinnati?" she asked. "Pittsburgh," Briggs said. "I need his contact information," Petra said. "If he's willing to speak with me." 2 days later, Petra sat across from Ray Okafor and his wife, Adiz, at a table in their Pittsburgh kitchen. She brought the journal. She explained what she had found and what it meant and what could be done. She said it plainly, without inflation, in the same voice she used for everything. Ray Okafor sat quietly through most of it. His wife held his hand across the table. When Petra finished, Adiz looked at her and said, "Why would you come here for us? You don't know us." Petra thought about that for a moment. "Because I know what it's like to need someone to show up," she said. "And because I can." She drove home to Cincinnati at midnight with the journal on the passenger seat and the November highway dark and empty around her, and she thought about her grandfather, who had done exactly this. Driven to places where he was needed. Brought what he had. Expected nothing back. And written it all down so that someone else, someday, could do the same. Cole's press conference happened on a Friday morning. His first public appearance in 7 weeks. He walked in without a visible tremor, without the careful pause he had spent months managing, without a hand pressed against his thigh. He was not fully recovered. He and Petra had discussed what recovery actually meant and had agreed it was a longer road than the word suggested. But he was present. Genuinely present, the way a person was present when they had come back from somewhere far away and intended to stay. He said everything. The diagnosis. The Pennsylvania site. The independent testing fund he had established for every site worker, no company affiliation. The formal remediation beginning the following week. The research partnership with Dr. Abrams at Ohio State and the clinical study she was initiating, properly funded and correctly attributed. He said that Ray Okafor had collapsed 3 days ago showing early-stage symptoms. He said Ray Okafor's family deserved to know that what had happened to him was not stress, was not weakness, was not his fault. He said the company had failed him, and that he intended to fix that failure beginning today. He said that Dr. Price had communicated Petra Hadley's identity to media contacts. He named it for what it was. He said that Weston and 2 other board members had worked, through intermediaries, to discredit Petra and remove her from the process. He said those members would be stepping down. He said the board's independent review had already begun. He said he had been asked to sign a statement saying his judgment had been impaired. He said the only impairment he could clearly identify was a decade of believing that money was the measure of what mattered. And then he said something that had not been in any prepared notes, because there were no prepared notes. He said he owed Petra Hadley a public apology. Not because she had asked for one. She had specifically, explicitly, told him not to make the press conference about her. He said it anyway. Ms. Hadley came to a hospital room in Cleveland carrying a worn leather journal and a canvas bag, he said. She was there because what she knew was real and because someone needed it. She lost her job because of this. She was in the comment sections. She was approached and offered money to disappear. He paused. She drove to a family in Pittsburgh at midnight because a man she'd never met had collapsed the same way I had collapsed, and she was the only person with something that could help. He looked into the camera. I want to say clearly, on the record, in public, I am sorry for what the people connected to me put her through. And I am grateful in a way I do not have adequate language for. In the back of the room, 2 reporters were already typing. Petra was not in the room. She was at the community center running the after-school program, because those children had nowhere else to be, and she had decided a long time ago that some things didn't stop just because the world was paying attention. She watched the clip on her phone in the parking lot afterward, sitting in the Civic with the engine off and the November cold pressing against the windows. She watched it twice. Then she called Marcus. I saw, he said before she could speak. She didn't say anything for a moment. You okay? He asked. She looked through the windshield at the parking lot. At the community center entrance where she had worked for 3 years in a building that was worn down and underfunded and full, every single day, of children who needed somewhere to be. Yeah, she said quietly. I'm okay. Cole drove to the community center on a Saturday morning in December. He came alone. No Briggs. He parked on the street and walked in carrying a folder and an envelope. Petra was reorganizing the supply room. She came out when she heard the door. He looked at the room. The bulletin board covered in children's artwork. The stacked plastic chairs. The ancient treadmill 3 seniors used every Tuesday morning. The cracked tile by the entrance she had been trying to get replaced for 2 years. The window above the main table where the winter light came in grey and honest. He set the folder on the center table. I want to fund this center properly, he said. Permanent endowment. New facility, expanded programming, paid staff. Foundation structure, full operational independence. You control the direction. Not me. Not a board with my name on it. Petra looked at the documents inside. I want a scholarship program for kids from this neighborhood going into medicine, law, and science, she said. Permanent. With real mentorship built in, not just money. Already in there. I want the journal archived formally. Ethnobotanical documentation, full attribution to Silas Hadley by name. Not a footnote to the clinical study. Its own thing. Also in there. She looked up at him. You thought about this before you came. I thought about it for 3 weeks, he said. I wanted to get it right. She looked at the room around her. At what it was and what it could be. She thought about the after-school kids and the Tuesday treadmill seniors and Devon and the comment sections and the $43 and her mother's prescription count and Adiz Okafor holding her husband's hand across a kitchen table in Pittsburgh. Okay, she said quietly. He set the envelope on the table beside the folder. A letter, he said. I thought about what your grandfather did. 40 years of writing things down carefully so they would be there when someone needed them. He didn't know who. He just knew someone would. Cole looked at the envelope. It seemed right to put something on paper. She picked it up. She put it in the pocket of her work jacket. She didn't open it then. He was almost at the door. How are your hands? She asked. He turned back and held both hands out, palms up, in the grey December light. Still. Completely, unmistakably still. Getting there, he said. He looked at her one last time. Two people from worlds that had no business intersecting, standing in a room the world usually walked past without looking in. He had looked in. That was the thing about it. He had looked in, and what he had found there had saved his life. He pulled the door closed gently, the way people close doors in places they meant to return to. Petra locked up the community center at 9 that evening. She drove home slowly. She parked in the lot of her building and sat in the Civic with the engine off and the December dark around her and the envelope in her lap. She opened it. The letter was long. It said what had happened, clearly and without inflation. It said that 4 Pennsylvania workers had now been identified with early-stage indicators, and that all 4 had been reached in time. It said that Dr. Abrams had received journal documentation from 2 other researchers in different regions, and that what they were building together was beginning to look like something much larger than one man's recovery. It said that Ray Okafor had called Cole from Pittsburgh to tell him that after 2 weeks of the protocol Petra had walked his wife through, the tremors in his right hand had reduced significantly. That he had driven his kids to school for the first time in 6 weeks that morning. That his daughter had fallen asleep in the back seat on the way home, which was the most ordinary thing in the world, and he had pulled over for a moment because it made him cry. And near the end, in careful handwriting she hadn't expected from a man who typed everything, it said, I have tried to think of what to say to you that is adequate to what you did. I cannot find it. What I can say is this, your grandfather spent his life putting something real down on paper for people who would need it. He didn't know their names. He just knew they would be there. That is what you carried into the room where I was lying on the floor. Not just his knowledge. His belief that a stranger was worth the trouble. I had never, in 36 years, understood what it felt like to be on the receiving end of that. I understand it now. Your grandfather saved my life before I was ever sick, because he saved the part of me that still knew how to become human again. I will be trying to understand what that means for a long time. I think that is right. Some things should not be quick. Petra sat in the dark car in the parking lot of her building and read the letter through to the end. And then, for the first time in months, for the first time since the comment sections and the apron on the counter and the $43 and the midnight drive to Pittsburgh and all of it, she let herself cry. Not with grief. Not with anger. With something harder to name and more worth having. The feeling of a thing completed. The feeling of a weight carried as far as it needed to go, by the right hands, to the right place. She sat there for a long time. Then she went upstairs. She put the letter in the wooden box on the top shelf of her closet. She set it down beside the journal. And she stood in the quiet of her apartment and looked at both of them together, one man's 40 years of careful knowledge, passed down to someone who would use it. And one man's honest accounting of what that knowledge had done, written in return. 2 letters. 2 people who had done good without being asked. Kept together, in a wooden box, on a shelf in Cincinnati. Because some things deserve to be kept next to each other. There is a version of this story where the lesson is about a wealthy man discovering a hidden gem and generosity flowing in one direction. That is not what happened here. What happened was that a man who had mastered everything money could reach found himself at the exact boundary of what money could not. And a woman who had never had money understood something he didn't. Not because she was born better or luckier or destined for it. But because she had paid attention to what her grandfather left her. Because she had taken seriously the things the world had dismissed with a gentle smile. Because she had been precise and honest and willing to act without waiting for someone to give her permission or credentials or a stage. And because when they printed her name and implied everything that story implied, and when the diner manager couldn't look at her, and when a 12-year-old boy showed her a comment section on his phone, and when she was $43 short of her mother's prescriptions, she folded her apron, covered the cost, and drove to the community center. Because those children had nowhere else to be at 5 o'clock, and the world would have to arrange itself around that fact. That is not a small thing. That is the whole thing. Silas Hadley spent his life writing down what he knew for families in a community that had no other resource. He did it quietly, without recognition, without a building with his name on it. His granddaughter took what he built and carried it forward in a canvas tote bag into rooms where it was needed. That is how the most important things usually travel. Not in headlines. Not in press conferences. In the hands of ordinary people who looked at what they were carrying, decided it was real, and refused to put it down when holding it became costly. The question this story leaves behind is not whether there are more people like Price and Weston in the world, people who will use what they have to erase what they cannot control. There are. They will always be there, and they will always be confident. The question is whether there are more Petras. More people who are carrying something real and quiet and unglamorous that the right buildings haven't acknowledged yet. More people who will show up, precise and honest, when someone is lying on a floor somewhere and the expensive solutions have run out. More people who will refuse to put the journal down when the world makes holding it costly. More people who will drive to Pittsburgh at midnight for a stranger. That question does not have an answer yet. Maybe you are part of the answer. If this story moved something in you, leave a comment. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me about something you are carrying that the world has not acknowledged. Tell me about a moment when someone tried to buy your silence and you refused. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Not for the algorithm. Because there are more stories like this one, and you should be here when they come. And if this one is worth sharing, share it. Some stories need to travel further than the room they started in.